Hello? I accidentally have a filter on my face. I don't want a filter on my face. How do I get the filter off my face? Okay, I've worked it out. I've worked it out. How do we turn off the hard eyes? Hey, there we go. And she's back. That was legitimately a mistake. But I guess it was a cute, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining me tonight for Down the Rabbit Hole. What are we up to? Episode number 6 now, I think. Thank you all for being for being accomplices in this work and for turning up to have the hard conversations. I'm really excited about tonight. I have a very special guest coming on tonight. His name is Jason King. He's a music critic. He's a professor at the Clive Davis Institute. He's a writer for Pitchfork. An amazing writer. He's written books on Michael Jackson, working on a book about Freddie Mercury. Very influential person in the music industry, I think. Personal friend of mine. And he writes for NPR as well. I mean, this guy just has a very long list of accolades. So I think he's a great addition for this conversation series. So let's get him in here. Let's get him in here. Jason, my man, where are ya? Oh, hey, what's up?
What's up, Kimbra?
How are you, mister?
I'm really good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just gushing about you and talking about your accolades in this industry and a little bit about how we met. When I think of our friendship, I think of Prince because I feel like our
It's a good
first
place to start.
yeah, great place to start. I mean, it's, I think Prince can teach us a lot on almost every topic. But yeah, you mediated a fantastic conversation that I was part of with Questlove and Spike Lee and some incredible journalists. And that was the first time we met properly. Am I correct?
I think so. I can't remember.
Uh,
So I know Christina Wheeler, the
that's
great
right.
performer and composer, is the one who put us in touch. So I always thank her for that, because I think she had met you through David Byrne, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
And so then it might have been the Prince event, and that was like the week that he had passed away, or maybe the week right after he'd passed away. And I
Yeah.
wanted to put something together, just to put some voices in the same room who could talk to his legacy and talk to his power and so on. And I was like, I have to have Kimbra at that event. So yeah, that might have been the first place that we met. But
Yeah.
since then, you came into some of my classes at NYU and you've talked, and I think we've been friends. And I'm just so grateful to know you because before I met you, I was a huge fan. Um, I've always thought that you're totally underappreciated in popular music, and that the work that you do is part of the genealogy of artists like Prince and Stevie Wonder and Kate Bush and others who engage in a kind of musical complexity. And I've been a fan, and then I got to meet you, and I was like, I'm even more of a fan. So
Oh, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I'm so like honored to have been invited into your world and really, really grateful you could join us tonight. We're obviously in a much happier place than we were previous weeks when we were doing Down the Rabbit Hole.
what
I
do
think
you
it was
mean? What do you mean?
what does
What
that
happened?
possibly mean? Yeah, I mean, I feel really excited to be having this conversation tonight because it's kind of this new burst of energy, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's this sort of sense of like trajectory that we're all feeling now. This
Oh
this
yeah.
um, this hope and this sense that we can really make a difference. But maybe more than ever, I'm aware that we have to be just so careful that we don't get complacent now. And I say we, and I really am referring to white people and people of color, but especially white folk. It is so important that we now realize it's on us to really turn up and do the work, and not kind of fall off these conversations. I feel like that's a risk, right? That you can unplug when something stops being
Oh yeah.
the top issue. So I really, my friend Atife Karimi, who's also passionate about this issue. We've started these conversations to really hash out how we can not only name and identify where we see systemic racism in our industry, which of course is the music industry, but also start to kind of brainstorm together ways in which we can demand change. And I say demand because as I have these conversations, Jason, I'm realizing like we are the music industry, like the labels, like, do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
they
of
are
course.
not, the executive level is nothing without the artists creating the music and people like yourselves who are the tastemakers and the people that are mirroring the culture. Yeah, take it, dude, take it. So yeah, just talk to me a little bit about where you're at. Give me a little landscape of Jason and just how you're feeling in this moment, and then we'll dive into some big shit.
Happy to dive. I mean, in terms of where I'm at, I mean, I'm in New York. Opened my window the other day and heard all of the screaming and shouting and yelling
Mm-hmm.
outside, and I didn't know what was going on, and turned on the television, and something lifted from me,
Yeah.
and I realized it had been 4 years of putting up with a lot of stuff. And, regardless of how people think politically and so on, there was a big shift that happened in this country, for 5 years ago, really.
Yeah.
It was part of a longer shift that was happening, but it was a big shift that had occurred. It was a major disruption. And a lot of us are still going to have to deal with the trauma of that disruption for a long time and what it has meant. It was in some ways a kind of X-ray that illuminated and revealed certain kinds of structural problems and crises that have always been here, but they've been exacerbated in the last 4 or 5 years because of the nature of the administration. And, when you ask me where I'm at, I think I'm at the same place that other people are at, which is, first of all, a kind of elation for the moment, which is suspended or maybe sustained by the fact that we still have so much more work to do, as you were
Yeah.
just mentioning. And so it's a moment of happiness that I want to give myself and that I think we have to give each other,
Yeah.
because I think we escaped something that was, potentially, I mean, I don't know that it would have been recoverable in an easy way had it been another 4 years. And so on one hand, I'm happy for the moment. On the other hand, I know that there's work to be done. I think that this is not a solution, but it's what some scholars refer to as a disentanglement. That there's no solutions to some of these problems necessarily, or that the solutions don't present themselves to us in an easy way. Like,
Yeah.
what's the solution to racism? There's no immediate solution. What's the solution to gender inequality? What's the solution to homophobia or to transphobia or to classism? These things require disentanglements, right?
Yeah.
They're like knots, and then you have to slowly disentangle them. And maybe the work that you do in your lifetime is one little disentanglement from a very complicated knot. But if there's enough collective disentangling,
Yeah.
we can get to a place where more people are able to participate in the culture in a democratic and inclusive way. So that's where I'm at. I'm just like, we had one disentanglement that just happened
Yeah.
last week.
Wow, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I really let's springboard off that term X-ray. I think that's spot on. This whole process and election and just last 4 years has been an X-ray
Yeah.
on folk in America, an X-ray on folk everywhere. I mean, I'm from New Zealand, and obviously coming into the landscape, trying to learn as much as possible, becoming more and more sober to the fact of how much privilege I have in this music industry. But what do you feel are the main things? This is a hard question to answer, but that it has revealed, because we can't go forward until we really can label and understand what has been revealed, especially in the music industry. I mean, people say to me, Jason, like when I talk about I'm doing a conversation series about systemic racism in the industry, I've heard some musicians say, well, music industry is so diverse. I mean, there is, it's one of the industries that maybe reflects more of our culture than so many others. Now, that's true to an extent, but let's talk more about like what this has really revealed behind the scenes, you know, what we've now learned about, yeah, from things like exploitation throughout record contracts, such a minority, you know, elitist sort of strand of people at the top. What are some of the things that we've really identified are the real issue at this point now?
Well, first of all, I mean, if you think of what's occurred as an X-ray, I think if you're looking at the larger scheme of things, one of the things it's done is it's revealed that there's multiple interlocking crises. They're interdependent crises that are happening at the same time. So even just beyond the music industry, let's talk about the world itself, right? So this summer, it was clearly revealed to us by way of George Floyd's tragic murder that we have a racial justice crisis, which should be no surprise to anyone. But I think the visceral way in which we saw what happened brought home for a lot of people the fact that this racial justice crisis is enduring, right? And it doesn't seem to have an endpoint, and it just seems to be getting worse and worse, and it's state-sponsored, and it's systemic, and it's structural. We're also, of course, in the midst of a global health crisis, a global pandemic, which is also racialized. It has a racial dimension too, right? Because of the people, so many of the people who are suffering, particularly in this country, are people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, people who are Black and brown. So we're in the midst of a global health crisis and a global and a racial crisis, which is also global too, right? And that's part of the reason that there was such a global response to it, because the treatment of Black people and Indigenous people worldwide, right, is consistently poor. So those two crises, plus a climate crisis, right, plus a gender crisis, plus, I mean, we can just go through the list of the numerous crises that we're facing, and these things are all interconnected. And so the issue becomes that these things seem intractable. They seem impossible to disentangle. They seem impossible to solve because there's so much that's going on at the same time. Plus, it's all exacerbated, of course, by the media itself. Yeah. Right, and that we're in the midst of a kind of media industrial complex that is, that brings this stuff to us in a way that is immediate, and that is, it just feels overwhelming at times. So all of that, of course, relates to the music industry. I mean, when you talk about like the climate crisis, right, that is reflected in the music industry too. I remember prior to, your dog is
my dog is yapping. Yeah, keep going. It's good.
Your dog is
she loves it.
Excited about all the crises in the world, how to solve them. But when we were talking about climate prior to this, I mean, there's obviously scholars and people doing a lot of work on climate in the music industry, thinking of the way in which the music industry has historically been a major polluter, right, in terms of the use of plastics and vinyl and cassette tapes and those sorts of things, and how much refuse there is in music industry. There's just so, there's been, it's contributed so much to carbon footprints. But really the main kind of mainstream conversation about the music industry and climate justice prior to the pandemic was like Coldplay, deciding that they weren't going to get on airplanes to tour anymore. And now I think we're in a state where we can no longer be that kind of complacent. Not that the Coldplay thing was complacent, but it's to say that there wasn't a lot of mainstream talk about this issue until such time as the pandemic hit. And then we started to realize, oh, you know what? We don't necessarily, like, cars don't have to be on the road all the time. People don't have to pollute the environment the same way. And so suddenly it's an X-ray, and you start to, it's revealed what the possible disentanglements might be. So I say all of this to say that in the music industry, it has long been grossly unequal in terms of structural opportunities, especially for people of color, right? That is the entire history of the American music business. It was formed out of the history of plantation capitalism, right? The idea of creating commodities and using bodies that are racialized, Black bodies, brown bodies, as commodities in a system of exchange and value. And that is the history of the United States. It's a history of stolen labor, right? Extracting labor from people whose bodies are marked by color, and then using that labor to increase profitability on behalf of the nation state. Yep. And so that is the history of this country. And It involved that kind of stolen labor, and that history becomes transmuted into the music industry itself. It's an institution in the United States that reflects the history of inequality, that reflects that history of stolen labor. And so when it comes down to like recording contracts in the United States were created in the late 19th century, early 20th century, right? And
Yep.
those contracts themselves reflected those values and those priorities around plantation capitalism. And so the idea of a recording contract, right, has always been a thing that's kind of sort of disadvantageous to music artists or to artists in music because it's modeled after a kind of plantation system in
Right.
which you're sort of like a slave to the industry, right? You never use those terms, but you're signed to the industry in such a way that they own your masters, right? They, in most cases, they own your masters, and it's very difficult to be able to financially recoup. Ultimately, just a very small handful of artists who are able to do that in a way that is financially beneficial to them. But of course, all of this is racialized. So, you know, the history of music in America is the history of the blues. It's the history of minstrelsy. It's the history of race records, which are some of the earliest records. And that's literally the term that's ascribed to some of the earliest Black music. Then it's the history of R&B and rock and roll. Well, I mean, swing and jazz,
Yeah.
R&B and rock and roll, all these euphemisms that are very weird and strange and funky. So it's like, you know, R&B suddenly becomes rock and roll when white performers are doing it, and when it's Black performers, it's R&B. Then you got, you know,
Mm.
soul and rock. It keeps going on and on and on into the history of hip hop and other forms and so on. So, you know, there's this history of appropriation, exploitation, which I consider to be part of this history of plantation capitalism, exploitation, value extraction, right? It's like, let me take what is good about what you do and let me extract the value from that and then not remunerate you properly. So, I mean, that history goes on and on. The segregation continues in music, in music companies. A lot of music companies are still very much divided between black and white, or white and
Yes.
Latinx, etc. I mean, not metaphorically divided, literally divided, where the black employees work as part of like the urban divisions or the black divisions,
Yes.
right? So this history, this is what was revealed to us. The things that we should have already known, right? That the music industry is structurally racist. It has been racist for a long, long time. It should not come as a surprise to anybody to have to hear that. I think people get confused because there's a lot of black visibility and brown visibility in the music industry,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of performers, certainly, who are black, and you can point to them and you can tokenize them and so on. But when you look at actual forms of economic remuneration and who's actually getting paid and who actually owns stuff, there's very little ownership in the music industry that's black at a mainstream major label level, right? At the indie level, it's a little bit different, but at the mainstream major label level, streaming service, et cetera, it's very hard to point to a lot of figures who are at the top echelons of the music industry in terms of their position and their access and their relationship to power. And that is something that has to change. And that's something I saw this summer that people finally started paying attention to.
And our last guest on this conversation series talked about how these systems are almost, I'm going to paraphrase it terribly, but set up in a way where you don't, that they have the subtlety where on the outside it looks as though everything is kind of fair play, but that's the whole point of the system, is that act invisibly, right? Sort of white supremacy acts in this way where it's like, you know, white folk think it's working for them, and it's kind of, there's diversity in the music industry, fine, but that's sort of the way it's set up, is that you don't, until you start digging beneath the surface, you start to see how, you know, the very systemic racism is actually it's profitable for people to continue perpetuating it. But it's not necessarily completely obvious to the white girl from, you know, I don't know, middle America who's listening to her favorite R&B playlist, you know. And that's what I really want to highlight in these conversations, is understanding like how this stuff does trace back to, like you mentioned some of the earliest, you know, minstrel, and Daphne Brooks elaborated on this stuff as well. It's sometimes not easy to, you know, see those links immediately, but once you start doing a bit of the work, it's pretty, yeah, it gets pretty scary. And you said we don't use the literal term slave, but of course we know that Prince did, and you know, he's been a bit of a entry point for me, because I was signed to Warner Brothers myself for 10 years. And I think that has been really interesting because I signed to them because I wanted to be on the label that Prince was on. You know, I was like, it was empowering to me to kind of, and then to discover that this man was very anti the label, you know, for so
Yeah,
long. Um, it's been a real, I use the term a lot, sobering up, like this whole
sure.
process of doing anti-racist work and also in the industry, um, recognizing where this stuff is so ingrained. I want to ask you, like, I actually do just want to touch on Prince quickly because I do
Sure.
think that he is such a incredible figure of someone who stood up to these systems so vocally, and you know, not necessarily directly using his race, but using his humanity as, you know, as an artist. And I think, you know, do you think it had, what kind of influence and power do you feel it had for Prince to make the statements he did around ownership, around just, you know, the striving for independence, and around like slavery? You know, it was very blunt, the kind of points that he made in that way. Do you think that that had, I don't know, I'm trying to think of if there's a situation now that is that like pertinent and like intense, because it was such a statement to make at that time and such a kind of potentially dangerous one, you know, for an artist to do nowadays.
Yeah. By the way, people are asking if we're going to answer some of the questions in the comments, which I'm happy to, but they're scrolling by so fast. I don't know how to how to
Sure.
do it if we can go back after.
Yeah.
Okay, happy to do that as they come in if I can. So yeah, I mean Prince. I think when it happened in the early 1990s, you know, he was at the top of his game. He had had an incredible creative streak, and things were changing in the music industry. Hip hop had started to really take a foothold, much more than it had even in the late 1980s. And so he was adjusting to some degree to that. He was adjusting to the fact that a little bit of the commercial wind had been taken out of his sails. He had not such a big hit with Graffiti Bridge, his film, and so on. And yet, he was somebody who had emerged out of this incredible history of people like James Brown and others who were very much concerned not just with the creative aspects of being in the music industry, but with also the business aspects.
Yeah.
And so James Brown famously had started his own record labels and his publishing, and the fight for to own your own masters has been a thing in the music industry for a very long time. It's just that very few people have been able to position themselves in relationship to labels or to have the kind of leverage that's necessary to be
Yeah.
able to own their masters, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly Black artists. But Prince emerged out of that history and was very aware of that history. He was very aware that he emerged out of a history of Little Richard being ripped off, of Chuck Berry being ripped, all of these artists historically being ripped off, and understanding and seeing himself positioned in relationship to people like James Brown and trying to figure out what his next step would be to take some ownership, to be able to distribute his content. Because I think that was one of the main things for Prince. It was that he was creating at a speed and at a volume that was greater than what the labels could do in terms of their distribution model. And so he wanted to be able to open up that vault and to be able to release stuff in a way that didn't suit his relationship to the label. Plus, they just owned so much of his material in a way that was not fair for him. And remember, at that time, he'd been on Warner since the late 1970s, and so
Yeah.
we're talking about the early 1990s, and he's still in that situation. So I think that was an incredibly important moment, for not just a moment, but like a span of years, right? It was most of the decade of the 1990s in which he was trying to figure out alternative solutions in the music industry, and he was doing this before a lot of other figures got there. So it was humanizing. I think he was deliberately deploying his race,
Yeah.
in order to make a particular comment about the music industry and its relationship to the history of plantation capitalism. I don't think it was a kind of naive thing at all. I think he was doing something quite specific. It was controversial at Warner at the time, and it was controversial in some Black communities too, because they're saying, well, you're not a slave. You're a millionaire. You got a lot of money. You have a lot of access. If the biggest issue is that you just can't put out your material the way you want to, or don't have control of the material that you signed a contract to, that's fine, but don't equate that with slavery. But I think he was making a point that was metaphorical and that was also in some ways real. He was referring to the kind of prison industrial complex that's, or the pop industrial complex, the idea that pop music is like a prison industrial
Yeah.
complex, right? That can lock you in and that can control you. I see you want to say, I don't want to keep talking.
No.
You want to
Yeah.
jump in? Okay.
So many ideas. You mentioned leverage, and I think that that's a really interesting part of the picture, because even when I think of myself, I mean, which is a person of privilege walking into the music industry, I had no understanding of ownership when I signed my 360 record deal with my manager written into the deal and all kinds of, you'd slap me if you knew the deals I'd signed. But I didn't understand that. I didn't have the leverage. I'm a kid. No one knows. No one cares. And I think about this process of actually being able to, have the education to understand what ownership is. I see this as the future. I'm also fascinated in it because I finally have the chance to customize record deals and do stuff like that. But how does one really equip themselves with not only I'm thinking of young Black artists going into this industry, so not only knowing the history of where they come from, but knowing the worth of the work and being able to create demands of these labels for a way forward. How does one become equipped in that way? Because I say that this is speaking from someone who was very ill-equipped for that early on, and I'm it's so much harder for so many in a position unlike mine.
Well, I think there needs to be more awareness. There needs to be more education. One of the comments or questions in the chat is about whether the streaming platforms are like the new labels in some ways, and whether they're continuing this. And absolutely, I would argue that streaming labels, while they have in some ways helped slightly stabilize the kind of economic downfall of the music industry that was happening after Napster, they've in many ways just continued the history of predatory value extraction with music artists. And I think that they have, and when you look at the kinds of returns that music artists get in terms of royalties and so on, it's very limited. It's very, very limited, and artists are not in the driver's seat. And the deals are largely between the streaming platforms and the record labels, and the artists are sort of accessories to those deals in some ways. Kind of back to your question, I mean, what does an artist do? I think the first thing is education, right? And making people aware of the status of artists as workers, as laborers. Because I think we romanticize the notion of artists as just kind of like, oh, you make music and you stand on the stage and you do whatever you do, and it's wonderful and it goes into my AirPods and I love. But like, you're workers. Artists are workers, right? Professional artists are workers who make money, who are entered into contracts with corporations, who are part of distribution systems. And I think if artists start understanding themselves as workers, that's firstly really, really important. And so there's education to be done to empower artists to understand themselves in terms of understanding themselves as value creators and understanding themselves as laborers, as if they were laboring at any other company, right? And then it's also educating the public about the nature of that labor and what that means and how it works. And so somebody just mentioned in the comments about Kanye, back in September, who was, put up on social media a lot of his contracts and was arguing for the way in which he feels locked into a lot of his contracts, and he feels that the industry itself is against him. And I think there's some truth there, besides some of the kind of showy stuff and provocative stuff around peeing on your Grammys in a toilet. The core of what he's saying, I think, has meaning if we can get to it. And so part of it is, like, I think what he was doing was trying to educate people that this is an actual issue. And here are the contracts. If you don't believe me, here are the contracts, and let's take a look at it. I think Prince was trying to do the same. George Michael was trying to do the same when he decided to sue Sony after Prince, following the model of Prince. And he got very criticized for saying that he was in the midst of slavery too. And people were like, that term does not relate to you, don't use it. Frank Ocean, I think, in his relationship to Def Jam is another really interesting example of somebody who decided to kind of flee from the label system, from the major label system. He kind of worked it to his advantage, so that he was able to release his album Endless, and then his album Blonde was his own independent work. But the examples are few and far between. and they need to be more widespread. So, you know, I'm at New York University, founding faculty member of the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music. We train
You do?
music entrepreneurs
Hmm?
as, you know, like empowered creative individuals who know how to write and read their own contracts, who understand how publishing works, who understand how money flows through the label system, who understand how to empower themselves in the context of the music industry, and who also come to, ideally, come to a record deal if they're offered one with a set of clearly articulated values and ethics for themselves that they, you know, that they know, like, this is what I want, and this is ultimately how I want to see it unfold in the industry. And I'm going to work only with those people who can help me achieve my values. And I think that's different than what a lot of artists have historically had to do. So what we're trying to teach them is to move through the industry with those values, but then to also develop as much leverage as you can outside of the major label system, outside of even the streaming platform system, so that once you are in a position where you feel financially and economically empowered and creatively empowered, and you're in control of your career and your team, that's the time in which you make the deals that you need to make, right? When you have that kind of leverage, and probably not before. And the good thing is that increasingly artists have the ability to do some of this stuff in the age, you know, where technology is at our fingertips and where you can actually like release stuff directly to the DSPs. Like, so you have much more control than you had in the past. The problem is there's so many people all trying to do the same thing that you've got to figure out a way to kind of rise above the traffic and get your voice heard. But you can empower yourself in a way that you couldn't in Prince's era, and that's important.
That's such a good point. You mentioned George Michael taking, you know, a stand and using the term, which I can understand why that was really criticized. And it brings me to my next kind of thing I want to unpack with you, which is understanding how whiteness, the construct of whiteness and white supremacy plays into the industry, and how a white artist who's trying to engage in this work and work toward a better future can be the best accomplice in this work. Because I've had a lot of conversations with my friends at this point that really highlight the importance of acceleration for Black artists, and really, you know, elevating and celebrating, and having to take a step back at times, you know, and realize that the world has been designed for white artists for a long time, and how are we going to level the playing field? How are we going to not only just throw a, you know, a Black Lives Matter post up, or throw a couple of $1 million, which is nothing for these record labels, but actually push acceleration. And so, you know, the first time you said George Michael saying that, it's like, oh, good on him. Yes, a white man standing up for that. But then there's also this like tension of like, oh, that probably wasn't the way to approach it. And I think this is, you know, is a thing I wrestle with all the time as well, being someone of privilege in this industry, wanting to be part of the fight, but also understanding that there's a risk that I can play into the very problem as well if I center my own voice and center my own problems and issues, you know. So maybe you could just help me understand that, how a white person comes into this work, because this is tricky and nuanced.
It is tricky. And, you know, I think part of the issue, there's a bunch of issues. So one, I mean, you talk about yourself as a person of privilege. I'm a person of privilege too, right? Like, I have gender privilege. I have all kinds of issues of privilege. And then, you know, in other ways, I don't have privilege. So the issue of privilege is complicated sometimes and multidimensional. People can exist in multiple spaces of privilege or lack of access. I think George Michael and Prince and Kanye and Michael Jackson, who also, you know, criticized Sony in the early 2000s with his album Invincible. Part of the issue is that they're celebrities, right? And that they have like class privilege, and that they have access to funds and platforms and those sorts of things. And very often the war that they're waging against these structures that have oppressed them are individual wars, right? They're not often on behalf of communities. So, you know, Prince's struggle against Warner was Prince's struggle against Warner.
Yeah, yeah.
George Michael's struggle was George Michael's struggle against that. So I feel like where a lot of this is headed is that artists need to make sure that they are working with other artists to topple and dismantle some of these structures of oppression, rather than just doing it sort of on their own behalf. It doesn't strike me that Kanye's struggle, while it relates to other artists, he's not particularly bringing people with him, right? To create the kind of protest that's required and that's necessary to actually make to manifest change.
That's
So
important. That's a really big difference, isn't it? The like the personal fight as opposed to the collective, like, and that makes me think of artists like Cardi B or Kendrick that actually like work to like, lift up their communities and kind of maintain. And this is hard as you get more and more famous, right? To like stay connected to your roots and all that. But it's like that seems to be a really important difference and something that we can look out for in the future of like what is the way that when you fight that fight you're actually elevating younger artists, and that makes us think black owned labels, labels that or white owned labels that are actually having a focus only on artists of color, or just really trying to think about what the ways forward are that are a collective as opposed to just the individual making a lot of noise.
yeah, the performer and producer Matt Dryhurst is the partner of Holly Herndon. He talks a lot about interdependence in the music industry rather than independence, and I totally agree with him on that. Right, the idea of people working interdependently, right, forming collectives, working as part of associations, finding common cause, and actually attacking and dealing with some of these structural issues. In an interdependent way rather than an independent way, because some would argue that the pandemic x-rayed or revealed or illuminated the reality that very few musicians can actually really be independent musicians, right? We told musicians for years and years and years, including a lot of my students, like live music is the thing. Like you're not going to be able to make money from recorded music in the aftermath of Napster, and you got to go live and do your concerts. And then it's like, oh, a pandemic in which you can't do concerts, and so how do you earn revenue? If the main ways in which you traditionally earn revenue keep getting, pulled out from under you. And so one of the keys, I think, is for musicians to band together and to start really thinking interdependently. And we can talk more about that, but that looks like music unions. That looks like forming associations and collectives in which people are providing mutual aid for each other, in which people are actually helping each other achieve the same goals. Because I think many, many musicians have the same goals, but very few musicians work interdependently because the music industry itself is set up around these individual siloed celebrities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it is. And so also celebrities tend not to want to rock the boat because they're earning income, lots of income, usually from branding deals, from associations with corporations. They have contracts with major labels often, and these labels themselves are owned by multinationals. So it becomes very difficult to make the kinds of critiques one needs to make about the nature of capitalism and independence that would allow you to then actually be able to think about what interdependence means as musicians. So I want to say that, but I want to get back to your original question, which was like, what can white artists do about some of this stuff? And first of all, I mean, I think that I like the term ally and I like the term accomplice, but for different reasons. And I know people are moving off the term ally because it seems either performative, and certainly a lot of allyship can be performative, where it's like, oh, I put up a black box, on June, whatever, in order to demonstrate my support for Black Lives Matter, but I've done nothing else. And actually, some of the other stuff that I do might even contradict, the statement that I've made that Black Lives Matter. So there's a way in which it can be performative, and let's say in a bad sense, because it just means that your connection to the work is shallow. Or not, it's not sustained. But I do think that there's something important about the performative part of it. And maybe because I have my degrees in performance studies, so
Yeah.
I think that performance can often be a first step of an entry into other things. That sometimes people need to be able to make a statement and need to be able to demonstrate publicly what their allegiances are and what their values are, and then they learn more on the way, hopefully, not all the time. Okay, but accomplice is an important term as well, because I think it says you're going to get your hands dirty and you're going to join me in the struggle, and you're going to go more than just surface and you're going to go a little bit deeper and you're going to do the work that's needed to be done. But the problem with the term accomplice, and I heard this from the activist and musician Karen Pittleman. She was saying that accomplice is a problematic term because it suggests that like there's some kind of criminal activity, and even if you just use it as a metaphor, if I'm a white person and I'm a black person's accomplice, like if we both go to jail, I might get bailed out and you might not because of the nature of my privilege versus yours. And so not everybody suffers the same kinds of consequences from the blowback and from the revanchism that occurs when people actually make certain kinds of protests happen and make certain kinds of change occur in the world. So I just want to frame that as like nuance around those terms because I think they can be a little bit tricky. But I think, okay, so here's the work that I think white people need to do. One is to particularize their whiteness. Right? And so
Okay.
what I mean by that is that we know that one of the mechanisms of whiteness is that it's everywhere and it's nowhere at the same time. And the
Mm-hmm.
scholar Richard Dyer has this great book that he wrote in the 1990s called White, which is about the visual aspects of whiteness and how whiteness is encoded into visuality, into films and photography and other visual mediums. And he brings up a lot of different things in that book, but he talks about the way that race or whiteness, the white race in particular, is a kind of like, it's a default position, right? It's like whiteness as the default and everybody else has to react in relationship to the default of whiteness. So an example from my childhood, I remember asking for a bandage and it's like a flesh colored bandage and it's white or it's pink. And it's like, well, that doesn't work for me at all, but whiteness becomes the default. White people tend not to think about those things. Black people think about those things, or brown people or any other color people think about those things in a very serious way, right? Because it means that you've been left out of a conversation, you've been ignored, and so on. So Richard Dyer says that like white power secures its dominance, right, by being sort of nothing in particular, but then also being ubiquitous and being everywhere at the same time. And I know you've had previous speakers come in and talk about those things. So what he suggests, and he's a gay man writing in the 1990s, he suggests that we make whiteness queer. So what he means by that, and it's folded into the all of the meanings of the word queer: strange, weird, unusual, but also even the meanings around sexual difference. But he says what we have to do is make it non-normative, right? Make whiteness not the default, but to make it, to illuminate it, to bring it into the light, to make it not the norm, to make it not the default category. And by doing so, you're then going to understand the mechanisms of how it actually works, the mechanisms of white supremacy, right? So that book is super important. Richard Dyer's argument about that is really important, but also I want to bring into play here George Lipsitz, who's a California-based scholar of ethnic studies, incredible work. But he has a book also from that time period called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. And
Okay.
in that book, he says, you know, we need to move beyond thinking about white power and white supremacy in terms of behavior, because a lot of people, well, especially a lot of white people, are really just concerned with the idea of racism as behavior. So it's like, I'm a good white person, I'm a bad white person. It's how I act toward you. It's only behavior.
Right.
And he's saying whiteness is actually about possessive investments, right? So first of all, race is a way of ascribing value to particular bodies to produce cheap labor, to then produce a certain kind of profitability. But what whiteness actually is, it's bound up in colonialism, it's bound up in settler colonialism, it's bound up in gentrification, it's bound up in certain forms of racial capitalism, predatory value extraction, forms of genocide, those sorts of things. And people need to be really clear about the nature of how whiteness has held power for so long and the mechanisms by which it's held power. And so some of those things are like discriminatory housing markets, for instance, right? It's about like the educational system, which is unequal and discriminatory. It's about like insider networks and nepotism. It's about inheritance and trust funds, and how inheritance gets passed on from one generation to the next generation in ways that are taking some of the spoils of discrimination, just passing it on. So what if you were to talk about whiteness that way, to particularize it, to make it strange, to make it non-normative, and to bring into light the various mechanisms by which whiteness actually takes power, then you have a means of actually destabilizing it and actually talking about it more and figuring out how it actually works. And so I think that's some of the work that needs to be done around that particularization.
And that's perception, isn't it? It's a perceptive way of looking at it. It strikes me that you're almost saying, because I don't want to say that you're completely removing the personal, because of course, in many instances, it very much is personal. A white person has to come into contact with what they, their skin color experience. But there's something about it that is at the same time kind of removing the intensity of the personal attack by saying, like, you know you come into this world not only as with a skin color and all the privileges or lack of privilege that that brings, but you also bring this entire history with you, and a lot of that isn't stuff that you are necessarily personally responsible for, because this is, this touches on defensiveness, right, which is such a big thing in work, anti-racist work, especially with white folk. But if it sounds like what you're saying is actually kind of zooming out a bit and seeing that this doesn't have to be such a big kind of there's something centering about that as well, right? The idea of like the guilt being laid on, and sort of that also reinforces this status of whiteness that needs to be somehow treaded lightly around or protected. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
that, it sounds like you're kind of wanting to zoom out and just be like, let's remove that constructed, and actually make it strange and odd and kind of like other, as opposed to being the norm. Does that make sense? I know that I'm kind of
absolutely. Yeah, no,
what
no,
am
absolutely. I'm so, I'm not terribly interested in conversations about like racism as good behavior or bad behavior, because I do think that it's very limiting to
mm,
conversations when people keep defaulting to that, right? Like, I
mm,
want to be a good white person historically, not a bad white person. So here's how, and if you're understanding history only in terms of like the good person or the bad person, I think that's really a simplistic way of looking at the way in which culture unfolds and which history unfolds and so on. So I'm much more interested in moving out of those conversations and actually thinking about the way in which race and racism are embedded structurally into all aspects of our culture. And then once you do that, and by the way, that is not to say that like, again, like interpersonal behavior is not important. That stuff has to be managed. That stuff has to be dealt with, and so on. And if somebody is screaming a particular, a racial epithet at you down the street, that's because, as James Baldwin would say, history is written on my brow. As a black person, history is literally written into my skin and into my face. And no amount of people saying, why can't we all just be one color? Why can't we? That's like universalism. That's another defense mechanism, right?
mm,
If I walk down the street and somebody decides to hit me with a baseball bat because of the color of my skin, that's because of a history and a racial context that precedes my existence on this earth that I'm a part of and that affects me.
yes.
So I have to, in order for me to move forward, I have to be involved with the struggle to dismantle that system that allows for somebody to want to hit me with a baseball bat simply because of the color of my skin.
And in the same, when I walk into the world, I carry with me a colonialism, like a posture of, or a posture throughout history that I may not be personally responsible for at every point of my life, but I must orient myself in the world with that knowledge and with that context, I guess, which then helps me get off the defense and out onto the work, hopefully. And
Yes.
another guest that we had on talked about the importance of nuance when it comes to whiteness. Just maybe even like culturally, like us sort of being able to abandon the term and talk about ourselves as we actually are, which is, I'm Irish Scottish. I'm, we're all, we a lot of us aren't able to articulate where we're from, but if we do have any nuance to where we come from, we start to refer to ourselves in that way. Do you think there's something important in that too? Could that help dismantle the kind of um, potency of this white race that we've kind of got in our head? Is that part of it, do you think?
Well, I think we have to think more about what whiteness is. I mean, that's the nature of dismantling it, is like, what is it that we're actually referring to when we refer to white? Because it's very rarely actually referring to physical skin color, right? It's
Yeah.
referring to a system of privileges, which is what George Lipsitz calls this possessive investment of whiteness. When we refer to whiteness, we think we're referring to hair or skin color or lips or whatever, but we're actually referring to a set of what the scholar Peggy McIntosh would say is an invisible knapsack of privileges, right? And white people are trained to not think of that knapsack of privileges as an actual knapsack at all. I don't actually have any privileges. White people don't even want to sometimes use the word privilege. White privilege is like anathema. I don't want to talk about that. So what if we did not use those terms, and we instead talked about the way in which whiteness becomes encoded in the social fabric through discriminatory housing, through, unequal access to, capital, those sorts of things. And then it changes the conversation, right?
That's, yeah.
Yeah.
I have so many things I want to talk about, but I really want to touch on this idea of moving away from what is sort of like the white lane is the normal music and everything else is othered in some way. This terminology of urban has been I've read a lot of our articles about there being a widespread movement to veer away from that word. Can you talk quickly about your thoughts on that, especially as someone who is a music critic, a reviewer, a professor, like what do you think about that? And
Urban, what was the last thing you said, Kimbra?
is it moving in the right direction to move away from these kinds of terms that keep us, thinking of Black music as other?
No, I think we have to decolonize the music industry. And I think we have to we have to decolonize our language in the music industry. Like I was saying, the earliest Black music records were considered race records. That's the term that it was literally ascribed to them. And a lot of Black music came up in the age of race records, where it was seen as inferior, it was other, not as important. Even if Black music was important, it was relegated to this category of racial music. And it really wasn't until, the rise of rhythm and blues in the late 1940s, where you have the journalist who then became one of the founders of Atlantic Records, Jerry Wexler, who is one of the people who renamed race records R&B, right? And so you have R&B music, which now describes what a lot of people were listening to. A lot of young people were listening to R&B in the late 1940s and early 1950s, especially white people. When it became a mainstream music, then they renamed it rock and roll, and they ascribed it to people like Elvis, while R&B was the term that was ascribed to Black artists. So it's always been about separatism. It's always been about segregation, because this music and this classification system came out of a history of legal segregation.
Got
Like
it.
the culture was literally legally segregated, like, right? So
Yeah.
so that's how the terminology emerged. The only problem is that the country moved to integration and the music industry did not. So it
Yeah.
continued to have this like dual structure, right? Of like this for white people, this for Black people, a record label with Black employees and with white employees, and so on. And you have the rise, it then becomes Black music in the Black music charts in the, I think, 80s. And then you have the rise of urban to describe essentially the same thing, right? You're describing Black music in the age of hip hop and of contemporary R&B as urban, but everyone knows what that refers to. It's a euphemism for saying Black, essentially. On one hand, it's useful because it means that you ascribe certain kinds of resources,
Hmm.
financial resources and human resources at a record label to this division that you call urban. So it
Right.
does mean that there's some treatment of Black artists that becomes important. It means that there's new, radio stations emerging that are in the context of urban and so on. So you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. If you get rid of the term urban, you're also getting rid of some of the financial and human resources that have been applied to those divisions at record labels. And so to get rid of it now is to say like, okay, like we're not going to pay any more attention to Black music. So that
Mm.
doesn't work. But at the same time, we can't exist anymore with these euphemisms and these terms that essentially describe separate and not equal in the music industry. And urban is one of those terms.
It is, yeah. God, it's so much more complicated, isn't it, than just binary sort of, well, let's rid of it, and then, you have another problem. Um, I I have to ask if there was one thing that you would like to see change in the music industry from this point onward, what would be the top of mind thing?
I think we need to shift the conversation to ownership, right? To like, I'm generally, well, okay, it's a couple of things. So first, decolonizing the music industry, which for me means altering the language that we use in the music industry, but also the one thing we didn't necessarily talk about is the way in which the music industries globally have followed a colonial model too, right? And so you have in the 70s and 80s the rise of like world music and the idea of sort of American, British music as being the dominant music industries since for a long time, since the rise of music, but it's the British music industry, especially in the 1950s and 60s and beyond,
Yeah.
that these are the dominant centers, and then everything else you outsource, right? And so even the rise of world music, the rise of these celebrity white men, intrepid creative artists who were kind of outsourcing music from the developing world, where they're talking about South Africa or other countries, and then bringing it back and sort of discovering it. Some of that music is amazing, some of it is great, but a lot of it just follows a kind of colonial model. And so,
Wow.
we need to, and all the way up to the contemporary moment where you have like Afro beats music, which is, I think, a problematic term to describe a lot of really interesting music that's coming out of Africa in the contemporary moment, which there is not a kind of global infrastructure yet that really fully supports that music. And I think it's partly due to the colonial history of the way that the music industry is unfolded. So first decolonizing the music industry, and then talking way more about economic justice, reparative justice in the music industry, which for me means a conversation around ownership. It means a conversation around redistributing resources from people who have to people who don't have, and from institutions that have to institutions that don't have. The conversation that's happening right now, and that's been happening since the summer, since the reaction to the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders and other murders that were happening in the summer, and the racial justice protests that emerged out of that. The conversation that's been happening for the music industry is largely about reform, especially when it comes to Black music. So two of the major institutions, Black Music Action Coalition and The Show Must Be Paused,
Yeah.
have been largely, although not totally, largely focused on reforming the existing institutions in music and reshaping them, looking at, questions of access and power within record labels and within streaming, looking at how employees raise complaints about bias and so on within labels. A lot of the activity, and I don't want to mischaracterize the work that they're doing because I think it's very important work, but a lot of that activity is about saying the institutions themselves can be fixed. They just need some reform, right?
Mm.
They just need to be rethought. We need to rethink power relationships in the labels and move forward. And again, I'm totally reducing the complexity of what they're trying to do, but nonetheless, just for the purpose of the conversation, I think there's another conversation that needs to be had, and it's larger than just thinking about Black musicians or Latinx musicians or Indigenous musicians, et cetera. It's really a conversation about artists and their relationship to this industry and the way that they've historically been oppressed and the way that they've had disadvantageous relationships in the industry for such a long time. And the way I think around that is to really start talking more about ownership, right? So in Black music, that means looking back at the history of Black owned record labels to see what happened and what went wrong and what went right, all the way back from labels like Black Swan in the early 1920s, the first Black run record label started by Harry Pace, to Motown in the 1950s, started by Berry Gordy, which was incredible for Black artists, but in some ways repeated some of the same kind of value extraction, some of the same kind of predatory value extraction, where artists were ripped off and so on in the ways that white labels had ripped off Black artists previously.
Yep.
You have VJ, the 1955 in the 1950s, which signed the Beatles and others, and you have lots of other record labels historically. Clarence Avant's labels, Curtis Mayfield had record labels, James Brown had record labels, on and on and on until the contemporary moment. So I think it's looking back at that history, seeing what worked, what didn't work, but then also turning to the contemporary moment and finding ways for the music industry to start financially funding new institutions, new structures that will support and sustain Black and Indigenous artists going forward, right? In a way that is about self-sufficiency and about sustainability. And that, I don't see that conversation happening yet, right? That's about saying, instead of just putting $150 million into charities and so on, we're going to put that money into creating, allowing Black artists to create new record labels, new management companies, publishing companies, new streaming platforms,
Right.
right? And for artists to also be able to create platform cooperatives, worker cooperatives, where workers actually own the streaming platforms and the labels and those sorts of things, about decentralizing power in the music industry. I could go on all day, but this is the conversation I want to hear much more about. I want to hear about economic justice and much less about like behavior in terms of racism. And not to
Yeah.
say that's important, it is important, but racism is much more than behavior. It's possessive investment, right? And so in the music industry, we need to start having conversations about how to dismantle those sorts of possessive investments and how to share and spread the power and redistribute resources.
That's so fantastic. I really want to get to these questions that people have been asking, and I wonder if you would be open to jumping on for just another 20 minutes or
Of
something.
course. Yeah,
Get,
sure.
yeah, just I know that people have really inspired by the things that you're saying. We're going to get kicked off in a second.
Yeah.
But let's jump on for just a little bit. And anyone listening, if you have some questions around these issues, let's dive in a little bit longer.
Will we lose the questions here, or do we have to save them somehow?
I think they're going to have to send them again. So
Uh-oh.
if you send a question, send them over again, and we'll get to you.
All right.
Okay, I'll call you back. Bye.
Thanks, Kimbra.
You're back. You're back.
I'm back.
I love talking to Jason because I always get so many like springboard moments of things entirely new perspectives that I could have on something. You really have a gift for that. I'm so thankful for you taking the time to take us there, take us to these new possibilities.
Oh, thank you for creating a space for these conversations to occur. It's really important.
It's funny. It's like while people are getting their questions in, I want to touch a little bit on appropriation, because I think it is something that comes up for me when you talk about this colonial structure that is played out in the music, like repeated, even though it's really subtle at times, maybe less subtle for certain people who can see right through it. Tell me how does one, and maybe I'm speaking like asking for myself, as well as an artist who benefits greatly from Black music and has been so inspired by Black music. How does one really do the work and be really diligent about understanding the difference between elevating and shining a light on influence, and actually reinforcing the same colonial type structure, even subconsciously, in the way that they kind of take and claim music from? Do you feel me? Like, obviously you know what I'm talking about, but how can we, let's touch on that at least.
So look, the reality in music is that people are influenced by things that they hear, that they feel, that come through them in ways that are mysterious, enigmatic, difficult to pin down. That's the nature of how people listen to music, how people create music, how people create anything, really, is by hearing things, seeing things, incorporating things, resynthesizing them, putting them back out into the world. That is always going to be the nature of how music works. There's only 12 notes on a keyboard, right? So people are going to take things and adapt them and form them and shape them in ways that make sense. The problem in the context of music is that all of this fusion and borrowing and stylistic influence and so on, which is normal and is natural and is organic, is happening in the context of a culture, of a society that is organized according to asymmetrical power relationships, right? Where some people have and some people don't have. And those power relationships are racialized, they're gendered, et cetera. They're organized on sexual difference, et cetera. So given that, you have this tension, right, between the way that people actually make music and then the nature of financial remuneration for people making music, right? And so because of this history and this context of stolen labor, and which literally defines, American culture. So what is to be done about that? There's literally nothing that can be done about that, because the nature of how music is made is going to be the nature of how music is made. What you can do something about is the culture that creates this asymmetrical power relationship. What that means is
it's sort of the wrong question to be asking in a way, isn't it? It's sort of like, that's one thing that we probably can't have much influence over. What we can have influence over is, like you said, where
where the resources go to establish more less of. I'm so sorry about my dog.
No,
Um,
we love dogs, so it's fine.
less of an asymmetrical balance, as you're saying, and more of a more of a culture that reflects equality in the first place, so that this, the appropriation isn't coming from. What am I trying to say? I'm getting so distracted by my dog. Let's jump to questions.
So, no worries. But I'll just say, um, you know, the conversations that have been happening in America and in other countries around rethinking capitalism, right? Whether you believe in capitalism, whether you don't believe in capitalism, whether you believe in socialism or don't, whatever the case may be, it's clear that the existing economic situation is not tenable. It's not sustainable, right? There's a widening gap between the rich and the poor. There's a decimation of middle classes. Like it's not sustainable. And what's interesting is that younger people have become very seduced by some of these kind of progressive socialist messages, which I think is a sign that things are changing, things are transforming. There, after Occupy, there has been an increased conversation about the importance of rethinking some of our economic systems and whether they can ever achieve the kind of parity that's necessary to have a truly inclusive and representative democracy. And I don't think they can in the way that they exist now. The immediate thing people hear is, oh, well, we're going to go to like Soviet communism, as if that's the model, right? So we don't even have the economic models that we need to
No.
really think about what inclusion and what true participation in this culture looks like for everyone. We're not there yet, and we need to get there. And there are other countries and other places in the world that do have different kinds of systems, right?
Right.
Whatever you might want to call them, whatever word you might want to use, where artists are certainly more taken care of by the state than they are the United States. I come from Canada, and in
Yeah.
Canada, artists have
You
the
feel it.
ability, I don't want to, yeah, in New Zealand, I don't want to over romanticize it, but artists have the ability to apply for grants and so on to do what people in a democracy should do. They should make demands of the state for certain kinds of, to fulfill their needs. And this is
Yep.
what the conversation around basic income is. And this needs to apply to artists as well. There needs to be basic income for artists because artists live most artists, not all artists, live in a very precarious way in relationship to their craft, right? It's like there's a global pandemic and suddenly I can't do live concerts. I can't, I'm not able to sell records the way that I could, due to the rise of peer-to-peer platforms. So how do I earn income? And again, this conversation has been answered by a handful of superstars, but there's a lot of people who are not able to sustain a career in music, partly because of the nature of the technology itself and because of the precarious social situation that musicians find themselves in. And so I would love to see the conversation shift more. And I think that is happening, right,
Yeah.
around economics and around the economic transference of power.
Yeah. So helpful to re-establish what the focus needs to be, because this is the threat when we get into anything like political or even, race related, is that you start looking at so many issues that you get overwhelmed because there's so much to kind of, and it's really helpful to kind of be like, look, that, yes, that's an issue, but we're not going to get anywhere by focusing on that. Let's focus on this. And you break it down in such a helpful way. I'm
And,
seeing.
and and it's amazing to me that people hear like Taylor Swift, like pulling her music from Spotify, which she did at a point, or like other artists at that level if they're having issues. Can you
Yeah.
imagine it? It's like
Oh, that's wild.
unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should
All
we
right. What
answer
we
questions?
got? What do we got?
Okay, so there's one. Jason, as a music reviewer, are you bound by industry terms and limits to describe the music, or do you play with new phrasing to get the music out of the boxes? I think
Mm-hmm.
that's an interesting question. So I just want to be clear, like, I'm not against all forms of classification for music. Classification and marketing is one of the ways that we actually find music, right? So if we just went
Yeah.
into a physical record store and it was just like a bunch of stuff in piles, we'd be like, that could be actually cool. That's how DJs actually find good music.
Yeah.
But we would suddenly have to base it on like the visual components or other components that have nothing to do with the music. So classification can be helpful as a tool for helping people find work. And I think that's also the work of critics and journalists in this era, is music journalists are able to help point people to important work because there's so many albums being released in a year, there's so many singles being released. And so you need some kind of gatekeeping and some kind of classification system to be able to allow people to find their way in the midst of a lot of product. Yet at the same time, obviously, some of those forms of classification become imprisoning for people, right? They don't actually emancipate artists. They actually lock them up in certain kinds of ways. They don't allow them to be free. So if you're a Black artist and you're doing like a cool fusion of rock and bluegrass and whatever, and then people keep calling you R&B, like
Right.
you're in a straitjacket in which you're not going to be able to make the kind of music that you need to make. And it also means that your music might not get played in the kinds of circuits and systems that it needs to in order to generate an audience. So as a reviewer, I sometimes have to use the terminology that I'm given, right? But at the same time, I want to try to write more about the ways in which artists disrupt categories and try to give us a little bit of category trouble and try to and Kimbra, I think you're a great example of that. You're somebody who's like, I think of you in terms of this idea of category trouble. You're somebody who's like, broken past the limitations of what a certain kind of pop music might sound like, and you've expanded those limitations. So I'm interested in doing that as a writer.
That's really cool, because it's like, yeah, you can't eliminate constructs altogether. Like it makes me think of the gender conversation. Like we are bound somewhat to pronouns, even if we, widen the spectrum of pronouns, we are limited with our language. So there is some degree of understanding we all have to have that we're kind of grasping to explain things. But what you're saying there is that like the way that we kind of, I love that, disrupt the stuff and allow room for those classifications to only be just a surface, and not to be oppressive, because when the classification holding people down, that's where it becomes. And again, this comes back to like the reason why I can make experimental pop music, for example, and maybe why Dawn Richard is very rarely called an experimental, pop artist and more of an R&B artist, whereas her shit like sounds more like Bjork than mine does, So it's like that's where the classifications are keeping some people down. But as you said, we can't rid them altogether, because it's reminding me of, I guess, just how we understand that there's always going to be a system at work, but how do we work within the system to elevate and uplift people? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's two things. And you're referring to gender before, which I think is important, because there's this old adage, and I don't know who said it, but you may not believe in gender, but gender believes in you, right? And so you can exist outside of gender, but you definitely live in a system that adheres to normative ideas around gender. And you have to at least know that, because then it allows you to actually empower yourself to be able to dismantle and deconstruct that system. So I think on one hand, it's the understanding and the knowledge that we live in a normative culture, a culture that ascribes to certain kinds of structural norms. And on the other hand, it's paying attention to fluidity and to, people who are moving outside of the binaries and so on, because those folks are helping disrupt the very norms that we should all be more aware of. Right. So I think it's doing both things at once. So if I can apply that into the music industry, it's about working within classifications and genres, and yet at the same time, also understanding that we need to do way more work to disrupt those classifications and genres, largely from the inside out, right? In order to have more people be able to fully participate in this music industry.
Yep. I love that. Yep.
Question. Do you think because Prince had his thing of being in control of artists on his label was in a way karmic of his deal with Warner? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Do you think because Prince had his thing being in control of artists on his label was a karmic way of his deal with Warner? I'm not sure of that question. Maybe you could just rephrase that. Derek Tuggle, who asked, thank you. Have you asked about how the new generation is now taking artist song demos and posting them on Apple Music so they can be available on streaming services? I don't know much about that.
Yeah, I don't do either. I saw a great question come through from Leslie Harden. If we can see that one, let me see. Here it goes. So here's a question from Leslie. Jason, as a music reviewer, are you bound? Oh, we've already done it.
We did that one, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was a great answer. Yeah, and a great question.
Let's see. Okay, what's the next one? What should we look at?
How can we support artists to help even out the playing field? I mean, that's we can spend some time there. What can the listeners do? What can fans do to help this?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of who the artist is we're talking about, right? So I think in terms of independent artists, there's lots of ways you can directly support certain kinds of independent artists if they have a structure set up for funding. So the artist to fan model, right? The direct artist to fan model or fan to artist model, where fans can fund their artists and help support them financially. So this is Patreon and other kinds of funding structures like that that allow you to make direct payments to artists that allow them to sustain themselves and support them. I think that's really important. And I think it's a transitional moment that we're in as a culture where fans are able to do that, because ultimately it's a one-on-one type thing, right? Like I was just saying before, how more artists need to work interdependently, they need to work collectively to try to find solutions to some of these larger intractable problems in the industry. And the idea of just everybody setting up their own Patreon or everybody having their own Kickstarter, ultimately everybody's doing this for the same reason, right? Which is that they're trying to find a solution, an alternative outside of the traditional funding structures of the music industry, which used to just be like, let me get signed, let me get an advance, let me make some music, and hopefully let me make some money on my fifth album by the time that comes out because I haven't recouped on anything. So people are trying to find a way outside of that, which is like the direct funding model. But I don't think that has its legs ultimately in the future, because I think it's forestalling a conversation that needs to happen about how artists work together in associations and unions and so on to actually bargain for themselves and to be able to generate the kind of collective support that musicians need to be able to survive as a group,
Yeah.
right, like as an entity of musicians in the world. That's a different issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why is there not an artists union? I have a question about that. Like, what? Why?
There are artist unions, musicians unions in particular.
Yeah, but
There's the
not.
AFM.
Okay. So why am I so clueless about this? It isn't quite the same structure though as other unions, right? I mean, it's the musicians union is different to say the like artists that are in a pop context or something like that. Is there a union set up for recording artists as such that is not so much like I always associated it with like classical music and stuff?
Classical music, instrumental music, but all kinds of musicians can belong. The AFM. There's a question here from Trevor Jones about the AFM. Should it expand membership, or are you thinking there needs to be a new type of model of organized labor? So the American Federation of Musicians is a long-standing musicians union that everybody has access to be part of if you're a professional
No.
musician. Yeah,
Yeah.
Local 802 as well. There's also like the freelancers union. There's a number of them, but more recently there's been the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers, which started this summer as a kind of response. I think this summer, maybe even a little earlier, started as a response to some of these larger issues that have been happening in the culture, and they have actually a list of all these demands that they are
Okay.
making of the industry in terms of health benefits and those sorts of things. I mean, most musicians don't have health benefits, right? They
No.
don't have proper health care. Most musicians don't have, access to like a basic wage that's outside of just like gigging, right?
Yeah.
Like I do a gig, I do a gig, I do a gig, and then hopefully more will show up. Also, in terms of like structural funding of things like the National Endowment for the Humanities, all these kinds of organizations that have traditionally supported artists. There's limited funding in the United States for some of these
Yeah.
things, especially when it comes to popular music, right? A lot of these arts organizations don't really fund popular musicians in the way that they fund other kinds of musicians, experimental musicians, jazz musicians, classical musicians. So there
Got it.
needs to be way more organization around that stuff. And that was revealed to us, especially in the pandemic, because so many musicians are just out of work and no
And they're now
possibility.
being referred to as essential workers. We're realizing the value of artists in a time like this. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of growth to happen in that side of things, the unions, it sounds like. And perhaps like great potential for more community and more interdependent collaboration, like you're talking about within that union structure, huh?
Absolutely, for sure. And, there are other people who have all kinds of other models to demonstrate. I mean, I mentioned Matt Dryhurst before,
Yep.
who teaches for us at the Clive Davis Institute, and is just one of the most important scholars, I think, and thinkers on this stuff to listen to. He has a podcast, Interdependence FM, that I encourage people to look at. But he's looking at also other kinds of models. There's a platform cooperative in which workers actually own parts of the streaming service. Peter Harris's Resonate is a good example of that.
Yep.
He's also into all kinds of other like fan-funded music scenes. What if you could own a music scene or be a partial owner of a music scene? So instead of just supporting every individual artist, what if you supported like contemporary R&B music, right? And you could be like a part owner of an actual scene, and maybe it's organized around venues and so on. But if you think of people doing like micro payments, like $10 or supporting $15, $20 for a scene, and you talk about millions and tens of millions of people supporting a scene, it's all of a sudden a whole different ball game, right? And so it's really about like workers owning the companies themselves, right? And so that's a whole different model than the one we have, which is about centralized power. So here we're talking about decentralized power. What if many, many people owned a scene? Or what if lots of people decided to invest in a venue that they thought was really, really meaningful and important, right?
Totally, because we see that kind of cult following around venues, and like look at the punk scene and the way that people's identity is wrapped up in not only the individual artists but the entire aesthetic and values of that, like, collective. That's super
And we're told things that I just historically have not made sense. Like I'm a big fan of R&B music, and I know that you are as well.
Oh.
And we've often been told that like contemporary, like not even contemporary, like let's say adult contemporary R&B, so like a more mature R&B, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, veteran artists, quote unquote veteran artists, heritage artists, are not as financially meaningful or valuable in the music industry as like young people. The music industry is so ageist. I can't even begin to tell you how ageist it is, but it's all oriented around how young you are, and understandably, right, because of the history of rock and roll and youth energy and music and so on. But suddenly this summer, emerging out of the pandemic, you have Versus, right, the Timbaland and Swizz Beat show on Apple Music, which often highlighted the work of either veteran heritage rappers or R&B stars, Patti LaBelle and Gladys Knight and so on. And Apple built an incredible financial model around this that I think prior to the pandemic would not have even been viable. I can't imagine like a lot of people would say, you know what, let's put tons of money into like Gladys Knight and Patti LaBelle, listening to each other's music on a stage together. But you know what? There's an audience for that. And so we've been told some lies about like what people are into and what people are not into, and like should only be about young people. It should only be about this, or it should only be about that. And instead, I think when you talk about like fan-funded venues and scenes and so on, there's a possibility for people's tastes to determine and to dictate what the industry looks like, not the other way around. Not a top-down industry, but a bottom-up grassroots industry.
Oh my gosh, that's really exciting and really possible, I think, with all the things that are starting to happen already. I love that. I think what we should do, Jason, at this point is, because I know you're going to share so many amazing resources for us, which the resources are hosted on the Demon Dap Instagram page, which is a label company run by my friend Atafe. And what we can do there is engage in questions in the comments if people have further things that they want to talk about. I'm sure me and Jason are happy to hop on there and give further thoughts, because otherwise we'll be here all night. But damn, like, wow, so much to marinate on, so much to just sit and think about, and hopefully for everyone tuning in tonight, stuff to really bring up with your friends, and when people are at a wit's end about what to do next, remembering there's quite a lot that we can do, and there's quite a lot of conversations that can start to take place around new infrastructures. So thank you so much, Jason, for just being so generous with your time. I know that like you do this for a living, you're always teaching, and now I'm asking you to jump on and teach me some more about things. It's like, but it's like, it really is so helpful to have your perspective in here. And everyone tune back in like throughout the week to see highlights from this conversation, and have the chance to ask some more questions in the comment section. Yay!
So glad to be with you and to talk with you and to see you. And I hope we get to see each other in person at some point, in when it's safe to do so and when we're able to do so.
Me too. Thanks, Jason. We'll talk soon.
Thank you,
Bye.
Kimbra. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.